First thing we're going to do is disconnect the 12-volt high power cable. We paid $8,000 for this RTX PRO 6000 96GB GPU to test it and benchmark it independently. And we bought it from this actual guy in this actual meme. The source of this card is the guy in that meme, except he's grown up now and has access to an RTX PRO 6000. And these days, he's busy with custom and bespoke PC builds on his own website, and that means he has access to interesting hardware. Now, it's a shame that NVIDIA has left us feeling like it's holding its engineers hostage for discussions and doesn't want to have fair and independent reviews anymore, but clearly we don't need them for the hardware and we can just buy it ourselves. So that's what we did. This GPU is the best marketing for AMD's Ryzen 9800X3D that we use in our GPU test benches so far. Mostly because we're seeing a 5 to 14% scaling benefit in gaming benchmarks versus the 5090. We also tore it down. We found out it's the most insanely dense PCB we've ever seen, and it's a reversion away from liquid metal, but maybe for reliability or for liability purposes. But it doesn't have 96 gigabytes of memory just because that's where all of the memory went when it disappeared from the 5060, the 5060 Ti, the 5070, the 5070 Ti, the 5080, and half of the 40 series SKUs. It's for other stuff too. Like, what was it again?
AI. 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 AIs. AI.
That's right. And we tried to test it. So today we've got gaming benchmarks mostly because it's interesting. I mean, it's still fun to see. And also, from a methodological standpoint, it lets us see how good the 9800X3D is and how much scaling room there's left in there to use it as a bench platform. But also, we tried to do some machine learning and LLM tests. We've never done those before. We don't have a full methodology defined yet, but we've gotten a good amount of experimentation done. And so we have some experimental charts to introduce with the 96 gigabyte RTX PRO 6000 versus the 5090 and the 4090. Before that, this video is brought to you by the Thermaltake TR100 Portable Mini ITX case. The TR100 case has a mesh ventilated front panel, heavily perforated side and top panels, and claims to support up to 280mm liquid coolers and large GPUs up to 360mm long and 70mm thick. It even has an optional suitcase with cutouts for the system, a mouse, keyboard, and monitor for transport. The Thermaltake TR100 Mini ITX case targets portable, smaller form factor PC building while maintaining compatibility for relatively large components. Learn more at the link in the description below. This card isn't for gaming, we know.
In fact, even Crysis works on here. Okay, so anybody who's a GeForce gamer, there are no GeForce gamer in the room.
We're gonna test it anyway as part of the review. So we also have thermals, acoustic, and we've got, again, some of the LLM and machine learning types of benchmarks in our experimentation. We've got more to do there, but it's a start. And this card, the biggest difference is that the Pro 6000 and the 5090, other than the 96 versus 32 gigabytes of memory difference, is the GPU itself, where the Pro 6000 has 24,064 CUDA cores to the 21,760 of the 5090. And that is nearly an 11% increase on the Pro 6000. That's a big difference. It'll show up in tests outside of just the VRAM difference. There are multiple versions of this card that we're looking at. The one we're looking at specifically is called the Blackwell Workstation Edition, but they also have so-called server editions of the cards, and those are intended to go into servers and racks where they're getting force-fed air from the front of the chassis rather than using this FE-style cooler, which is the one we're looking at today. So the one we're looking at is more similar to what we would see in sort of the consumer to prosumer workstation class, and it does use an FE design. Getting into the specs, the RTX PRO 6000 Blackwell GPU is built on the GB202 Blackwell die. The full GB202 die has support for up to 24,576 CUDA cores, 768 TMUs, 192 ROPs that might even be present, and is also used for the RTX 5090. The Pro 6000 variation on this GPU has 24,064 CUDA cores, so it's down by 512, and it isn't a perfect die, which helps with yields. It's also cut down to 752 TMUs from 768. It still has theoretically 192 ROPs, and they'd better all be there for the price you're paying. The card is also running 188 RT cores and supports PCIe 5.0x16. Advertised clocks are 1590 MHz base and 2617 MHz boost via TPU. The real reason people buy this card, though, is its memory, which is 96 gigabytes of capacity of GDDR7. The closest consumer class card to compare against would be the 5090. It's built on the same die, but it's cut down more, with 176 ROPs, 680 TMUs, 170 RT cores, 21,760 CUDA cores, and 32 gigabytes of GDDR7 on a 512-bit bus. It's also far lower in price at $2,000 to realistically $3,000 is the range, rather than $8,000 to $11,000. For some notable differences, the 5090 obviously only has a third of the memory capacity of the Pro card, and the RTX Pro 6000's die is almost 98% present and functioning, while the RTX 5090's die is closer to 88.5%. With the remainder either being fused off or defective fallout and fused off. Now, technically, somebody could buy 4 or 5 5090s for the price of one RTX Pro 6000, and as Jensen Huang says,
the more you buy, the more you save. That's right. The more you buy, the more you save. The more you buy, the more you save.
Whether you buy completely from us, that's fantastic. Nothing gives me more joy than when you buy everything from NVIDIA. I just want you guys to know that. But it gives me tremendous joy if you just buy something from NVIDIA.
So the use case for this GPU really comes down to having as much memory as possible on a single card. The teardown is the most interesting to us, so let's get into the teardown first, then we'll get into the benchmarks. And we completed all the benchmarks before doing the teardown, but we'll start there because it was the most fun for me. Gloss, fingerprint magnet, otherwise the layout is the same. It's still a 2-slot card. It's still got the 2 large fans on the front. It's a double flow through. So the actual PCB is here, where you can actually kind of see this one fin where it's starting to get taller than those this direction. So that taller fin to that taller fin, that is the backplate, the backside of the PCB plate, which is right here. PCB is going to be under that. And then the PCIe slot is connected via a customized pinout adapter that's on the board right around here. So hopefully this is the same disassembly process as like a 5080 or a 5090. This is a 5080. Externally, this is identical to a 5090 FE. So we're going to use this as a point of reference for the RTX Pro 6000. Internally, there's some differences from the 5090. So some differences to the 3D VC, the 3D vapor chamber, no liquid metal, things like that. But otherwise, it looks the same. And the RTX Pro 6000 should share most of the features. So a couple things that are familiar. This dips down. It's kind of hard to see, but there's basically this depression here in the middle, and that is supposed to help with pressure drop. So we talked about that in probably one of the last thermal engineering interviews I'll ever do with an NVIDIA person, unfortunately. And then there was another one here, same idea. And the design is full flow through, so they're able to push the air straight through the card rather than into a PCB or something that would then halt the air's movement. For the front side, not much too different. Let's take a look just in case. So some fins here, what we'll want to look at are these deco fins, as Malcolm has called them at NVIDIA, or are they actual fins, deco being decoration. On this side, you see it's a solid plate on all 4 corners here. And then same thing on the outer edges here. These are finned, just a question of whether they connect to the rest of the fin stack or not. And then same for these corners. But otherwise, it's looking pretty similar so far. The top retains this angle on these vented slats, top and bottom. And we did Schlieren photography of this in the past with the 5090, where you can actually see it does work and it projects the air that way, which is great in a horizontally mounted situation because it'll get the air kind of up and away from the card. So when it hits the glass of the case, it'll get kind of pulled up and out by the CPU cooler. So all that looks similar, but now we're going to get into the disassembly. First thing we're going to do is disconnect the 12-volt high power cable. All right, so we need to pop this up, but if I remember correctly, the first step's actually going to be on the back here. We need to remove this plate, which is covering one screw, I think here or here, that's holding that back X-frame in. I'm gonna go ahead and track these on the grid too. I don't think it's gonna be any more complicated. It's been a little while since I've taken one of these apart though, so to be on the safe side, I'm gonna track it. And if you want your own mod mat like I'm working on, you can go to store.gamersnexus.net and grab one. We have the 4 foot by 2 foot ones and a medium version that's a little smaller. with the pinout design, screw tracking grid, ruler, all the other stuff on it. Ooh, it should be that one, that kind of loner right there. That's going to be a Torque 6, which we have in our toolkits if you want to grab one, also on store.gamersnexus.net. All right, cool. Pretty easy. I think it's plastic here now. Hopefully there's still metal underneath, because the other one was actually a full metal backplate covers here, although those were just covers. This is the part that matters. But let's go ahead and pull these screws. All right, so that's a Torque 6. Now the real reason that NVIDIA did this gloss plate instead of the metal, so this gloss here, is so that the next time one falls off the back of a truck and is sent to a YouTuber, they can identify who took it. I think it comes like this, yeah. This, I mean, you know, again, we really praised this thing in the 5090, and definitely not afraid to do it again. The whole assembly of this, like FE modern design, it really is kind of like masterful mechanics. Just assembles really well. There's no like bullshit Appleification of trying to prevent disassembly. It's easy to take apart, but it's also still like pretty clean. So despite like our issues with NVIDIA's marketing, you know, I think the fact that we're willing to still give them credit for this stuff kind of shows that for us it's isolated. There's product and then there's company. And unfortunately, right now, the company is not acting in a way that I think is good for consumers, but the product execution for the cooler is still pretty masterful. All right, so this is going to remove the clamp that holds the PCIe, like kind of, well, there's two more here, slot to the card. On the FE, this was like, if I remember correctly, it was metal. Okay, cool. So that pops out. There's the PCIe adapter. I think that was fully custom for NVIDIA. If I remember what Malcolm said correctly. That's in our interview if you wanted to learn from it. This should, I think, just pull off now. Yeah, there we go. I don't know if that's what that hole is there for, but it makes access for prying pretty easy. Cool. So there's our first look at where all the memory's connected, or a lot of it anyway, probably half of it. So you can see we've got 1, 2, 15, 16. Holy crap, that is a lot. So 16 memory modules on the back with, unfortunately for us, the clay kind of thermal pad. This should reassemble fine. We're done with thermal testing. We do that after this. But these really, as you can see, there's just like no way to have these not tear when you take it apart. So I mean, sometimes just because it leaves the gaps in the same spot, you can push it back down and be fine. Sometimes you need to replace the pads, but that's going to be annoying for me. I would recommend not taking it apart if you can avoid it, just because of that. But anyway, large metal backplate, finned, just like the other one. Pretty cool. This is a crazy dense PCB as well, which on its own is an engineering challenge. Okay, cool. I'll do each of these about halfway to evenly release the pressure on the GPU. And then you can see the 12 volt high power over here, 12 volt 2x6. Also, unfortunately, in this process, we're going to have to reapply liquid metal at the end, which isn't particularly difficult. It's just kind of takes some care. Massive leaf spring here. Not any different from the 5090 FE though. We've already seen that. If I remember correctly, I think we're at the point where I can pull this. I really hate to do it because of the liquid metal. So it's like, if we stop right now, my life is gonna be significantly easier, probably save a little bit of time. Well, I'm glad we didn't stop. That is interesting. Wow, all right. So there's paste on it. And also the largest substrate, like sort of retention plate I've ever seen. That is massive. That's for leveling everything and also keeping the substrate straight. But wow, man. Paste. I really wasn't expecting that. I was seriously gonna just like stop too and say, okay, we know what the rest looks like. Couple things. First of all, this pad down here went over the edge a little bit. You can see, fortunately it got smashed down, so it didn't cause any mount abnormalities. We can look at the paste pattern. Looks like heaviest imprint right in the center. So if you look here, that looks like the highest pressure region by application. And then on the outer edges of both of these, you can see it's a little bit lighter pressure. So I mean, that's fine. That's more or less what we want to see. So NVIDIA uses a PTM Honeywell solution for theirs, according to Malcolm from previous interviews. It's not the only provider out there, but it's the most known, and NVIDIA's been using them for a while now. In terms of pads, so these are clearly making contact to the sort of ribbed surface area of the base plate, which would be this down here. So that's the base plate. This is the 3D vapor chamber. So 3D VC specifically, it's using pipes that aren't literally heat pipes the way we typically know them, but they are pipes that run horizontally. And so again, from that Malcolm interview previously, that NVIDIA decided to hold hostage from us in the future, and what a horrible thing they've done. But the pipes that protrude out the sides, we learned from him, are special. Like I think it was actually to his knowledge, was the first time that pipes were pulled out the side of a 3D VC rather than extending vertically. For other details that are interesting, so these pads were smashed over the sides a little bit. So they were extended past and they got kind of crumpled and folded. Doesn't matter, it's fine. A little bit of lack of coverage on the corners for that memory module there, 15, 16. So that is going to be 32 total memory locations, which means that these are 3 GB modules. 3 times 32 should bring us to 96, which is the capacity of this card. So that's where all the memory is. A couple quick things we noticed here after the fact. First of all, there's some areas of poor contact along one edge of inductors where we noticed that some of the inductors, only half of them are actually covered by a thermal pad. One of them, it was only like a third of the inductor. So that's not good. They really need to get the pad placement correct on these $8,000 to $11,000 GPUs. Just an extra phase up near the 2x6 connector where the pogo pin connector would be on the 5090, but on the 6000 there isn't a pogo pin connector. That helps accommodate the loss of surface area elsewhere. And then they've added 2 phases south of the connector on the lower edge of the board, but they're trading some of the phases with larger inductors or traditional inductors as well. So there's some give and take there. The VRM is also complicated. I mean, you can see they've got components sprawling horizontally as well, not just up and down, but left and right, where they've got these pads shoved in the crevices there for another 2. See, that's going to be FETs. So those are MOSFETs right there. You can see the shallower ones on the cooler are going to be the FETs, and the deeper ones are going to be those. Or actually, no, those are inductors. Wow. Also, look at all these tiny components down here. This is so insane, the density of this PCB. I'm really surprised there's no liquid metal on this. Well, that answers our question. We I don't know if the thermal test is going to be before or after this in the review, but one of the things that I already recorded the voiceover for it because we do that before this. And I was trying to figure out how to explain the 10-degree increase versus the 5090, considering everything else is about the same. And there's our answer. We now know the impact of the liquid metal on a very similar. There's a different GPU, but it's very similar heat load and mostly similar density. So it was worth about 10 degrees, and that was noise normalized too, more or less. So this is a GB202- 870-A1. So that A1 is kind of their shipping revision. The 870 is the subclass of the GB202 die, where GB202 can also include 5090s, 5090Ds, and so forth. So this is the 870 variant. And then we can see Taiwan there, which I mean it's TSMC, so that's pretty much the only place you can get that right now. And otherwise, it's a 5090 die. It's just a fuller version of it, fewer defects. So that is going to be it for the teardown of, I guess, the modern Titan, the Pro 6000. This thing is crazy. The power density is obscene. The VRM layout where they've pushed it all out to the edges here, we've got more of that on the back side. with just a ton of MLCCs everywhere, 32 memory modules in total, and then weirdly no liquid metal. So that still kind of baffles me. I guess maybe it's a longevity play. Maybe they're less worried about like that extra, say 10 degrees in a like for like scenario than they would be about potential issues from liquid metal in a professional environment where someone who pays $8,000 to $11,000 per card might be buying a lot of them and would be really angry if they ever had any kind of issues. So maybe it's a longevity thing. Cost savings seems absurd to even speculate on because it's like $8,000 to $11,000. I don't think they're trying to save pennies on the TIM to low dollars. It's possible, but it's gotta, I'm thinking more of like a longevity thing. So anyway, what we'll do is clearly add MFG to the charts. That way I can send NVIDIA a question and learn from them and have the privilege of knowing more about their product in exchange for some kind of favor, because that's how it works. So that's gonna be it for the teardown. Super cool. I'm still impressed by the way this was all built and happy to give them credit for that. And now we're going to cut back over to the rest of the review and benchmarks. And now we'll get into thermal testing. Thermal testing is up now. The RTX 5090 uses liquid metal with a 2-slot FE cooler that genuinely is one of the most impressive GPU coolers we've ever worked on. The prototype 4090 cooler we disassembled was more impressive in mechanical and cooling capabilities, but it was huge and impractical to manufacture. It was super cool though, and that led to the 2-slot 5090 FE that in most cases has done well, with the exception being memory cooling. We found that memory ran hot on our 5090 FE. That's more of a concern with the Pro 6000 as well, since it has so much memory. Here's a thermal test during a fixed render workload. The 5090 ran at around 72 degrees Celsius for the GPU core temperature in this test, which is overall excellent considering its 2-slot design. The VRAM for the 5090 ran at around 90 degrees Celsius, which was hotter than we were comfortable with. Once accounting for installation into a case and potential long-term implications of pad dryout and dust, that's a high temperature. The Pro 6000 ran its GPU core at a significantly hotter 82 degrees Celsius in this test, so it's about 10 degrees warmer than the 5090. The GPU memory was about the same, measuring 88 degrees via software. None of that means anything without fan speeds though. Using only the auto settings, so following whatever vBIOS has programmed for the target GPU temperature, the RTX 5090 ran at 1550 to 1600 RPM for the average fan speed. The Pro 6000 ran at 1700. It's a little faster with a much warmer core, but similar memory thermals. Next, though, we need acoustics to understand what any of this means. Acoustics are next. For this testing, we're using our hemi-anechoic chamber that we heavily invested in for improving our test quality. Our next major improvement will be upgrading the microphone, which is currently our bottleneck. We could hit a 6 to 8 dBA noise floor with a better mic, but we're currently at 13.6 to 15.0 over the floor. Still a great result though. The RTX 5090 on the chart here ran at about 32.5 dBA when left to do whatever it was going to do to control the fan speeds, with the Pro 6000 hitting about the same noise level. However, the noise floor was slightly different between these two, so adjusting for that, the Pro 6000 would end up about 1 dBA louder under the same conditions. This is hardly noticeable as a difference, if noticeable at all for most people. Overall, the cooler design remains good when taking its size into consideration. The 5090 had higher noise levels in the higher frequency range, particularly 8,000 to 10,000 Hz. It also had a peak around 175 Hz, with the Pro peaking at 194 and following otherwise a similar pattern, just adjusted right. Generally speaking, this mostly follows the same trend. Our frequency cutoff is 150 Hz, so the higher result on the left below that can be ignored. Gaming benchmarks are next. Dragon's Dogma 2 is up first. Tested at 4K, the RTX Pro 6000 landed at 140 FPS average, which has it ahead of the RTX 5090 by 5.8% for average frame rate. Those aren't notably different here, so in other words, that's about an extra $1,000 per 1% improvement, or about $780 or so per 1 FPS increase over the 5090 when calculating by the percent difference in cost for these two. The lead in the RTX Pro 6000 is about 42% over the 4090, with the 5090 already ahead of the 4090 by about 34% here. At 1440p, the lead over the 5090 is expanded to 6.3%, ensuring we get our full gaming value out of the card. For just $6,000 more, at least, you can get another 6% of gaming performance. Low performance is not different outside of the usual scaling along with the improvement in the average frame times. The RTX Pro 6000 hits 201 FPS average here, leading the 189 FPS of the 5090 and the 155 of the 4090. NVIDIA currently holds the entire top cluster of this chart, with AMD mostly focusing on the modern mid-range and Intel focused on the modern low-end. We next tested at 1080p, which is what we know all buyers of this card really wanted to use it for. So-called AI use cases are obviously secondary compared to playing video games at 1080p. The RTX Pro 6000 leads this extremely important and pivotal chart with a 226 FPS average, dropping to just a 5.3% lead over the 5090. Honestly, there's something valuable that comes out of this chart though, which is the marketing for AMD's Ryzen 7 9800X3D, which is somehow keeping up with these GPUs enough that it can still produce distinguished results between the $2,000 to $3,000 5090 and the $8,000 to $11,000 Pro 6000. That's impressive. This is more amusing to us as it proves the longevity of our bench hardware more than anything else. Final Fantasy XIV is up now, tested first at 4K. The RTX Pro 6000 ran at 208 FPS average, leading the 5090's 184 FPS average results by about 13%. That's a larger gain than we've seen in some of the other games, though obviously this is still a card intended for VRAM intensive use cases and not for gaming. That there's still some power left beyond the 5090 though is what's more interesting, alongside the fact that the 9800X3D is so capable. Lows scale with the average and are not meaningfully better with the Pro 6000. Tested at 1440p, we see a 10% improvement in frame rate against the 5090, up at 348 FPS average for the 6000. Again, we're mostly excited to see the 9800X3D continuing to scale and illustrating that there's room left for another generation of testing on these benches. Lows remain in step with the average. At 1080p, the Pro 6000 again outperforms the 5090. This time it's reduced to about 4.3%. Let's move on. Up next, we're testing a card no one buys for gaming with a game no one plays. In Starfield at 4K, the Pro 6000 ran at 115 FPS average, leading the 5090 by about 7%. Lows are mostly within error here. The value is somewhere in the range of $700 to $1,000 per 1% improvement, depending on the price of the 5090. At 1440p, the RTX Pro 6000 ran at 154 FPS average, leading the 147 to 148 FPS average result of the 5090 marginally. The improvement over the 4090 is 17%, with the 5090 having previously led the 4090 by 12% in this test, so we're clearly becoming bound elsewhere because that's not what we see in other tests. The 1% lows for the 6000 are noteworthy here. At 89 FPS for the average 1% lows, the Pro 6000 outperforms the average frame rate of the 5070 and nearly matches the 4070 Ti with just its 1% numbers. Resident Evil 4 is up next at 4K. In this one, the RTX Pro 6000 ran at 219 FPS average, leading the 207 FPS average result of the 5090 by 6%. That's consistent with most of the other tests so far. The lows, again, are not meaningfully different. The 4090's 151 FPS average allows the 6000 a lead of 45%, or the 5090 a lead of 36.7%. At 1440p, the Blackwell Workstation card ran at 371 FPS average, pushing the frame rate measurably higher than the roughly 350 FPS average of the 5090 previously. We're looking at about a 6.5% improvement here, aligning with the prior results again, and yet again showing how good the 9800X3D is. Black Myth Wukong is up now, tested first at 4K and representing one of our heaviest non-RT workloads. The RTX Pro 6000 didn't break the 100 FPS barrier, but it was the first card to exceed 90. Not that this particularly matters to anyone when the 5090 was already in the mid-80s, but it's past an arbitrary landmark. The 6000 outperforms the 5090 FE result we had by 7.4%, above what we've seen on average thus far by about 1 percentage point from the other games. 92 FPS average is a good showing in this benchmark when at 4K. The next card on the stack is the 4090 at 67 FPS average, then the 5080 at 58 FPS average. At 1440p, the Pro 6000 ran at 138 FPS average and led the 5090 marginally, but it was technically still a measurable improvement. Total uplift is 6.1%, aligning with the Resident Evil 4 test previously. Once again, the next card is the 4090. After this is the 5080, which isn't that different from a 4080 Super, which isn't that different from a 4080. We don't have all these on the chart because they're all basically the same, and those aren't that different from the 5070 Ti. Black Myth Wukong at 1080p is next. Selfishly, this is interesting once again for probing if there's room in the CPU for more GPU. Turns out there is. With the 9800X3D, the RTX Pro 6000 ran at 168 FPS average, improving on the 5090 by about 5%. That's less than we saw at 1440p, which was less than we saw at 4K. So this card is gaining ground as resolution increases in this game. Dying Light 2 is up next. At 4K, the Pro 6000 ran at 144 FPS average, which is a noteworthy improvement on the 126 FPS average of the 5090 FE. That's a surprising 13.8%, which so far matches only one other game we've tested, and that was Final Fantasy. Most of the other games are closer to 5 to 7%. The 4090 is next at 91 FPS average, meaning the Pro 6000 is 59% ahead of the 4090. At 1440p, there's still scaling. The Pro 6000 is now at 246 FPS average, leading the 5090 by almost 13%. That's a drop from what we saw at 4K, but still more than most other games. Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty is one of our next most intensive games after Black Myth Wukong. At 4K, the RTX Pro 6000 breaks through 100 FPS and hits 108, leading the 5090 by 13.5%. This is actually a pretty big lead. This is another one of the games that has a larger average improvement that's still not worth $8,000 or $11,000 or really any grand that is on top of the 5090, whatever they're selling these for gaming, but it's interesting to see the difference at all given the focus on so-called AI workloads. At 1440p, the Pro 6000 ran at nearly 200 FPS average, about 9.4% ahead of the 5090. This remains one of the larger gaps for 1440p testing, although again, it's obviously not something anyone should remotely consider primarily for gaming. The 4090 is down at 135 FPS average, meaning the Pro 6000 leads it by 48%. We're leaving 1080p in because it's the only place we see a bottleneck. Finally, we run into what seems like a CPU limit here. The Pro 6000 and 5090 are at the same level of performance as is basically the 4090. Everything here is limited. That means our 1440p results were at least somewhat limited as well, with minimally the upper bound bouncing off of the limits. Ray tracing benchmarks are next. We'll start with the heaviest one, which is Black Myth Wukong at 4K with upscaling. In this test, the RTX Pro 6000 ran at 92 FPS average, which has it barely any different from the 88 FPS observed on the 5090. We're under 5% of uplift here, so it'll be interesting to see if RT workloads don't produce as much change as rasterization. At 1440p upscaled, the RTX Pro 6000 ran at 131 FPS average, leading the 5090 by just 3%. There's not much change in this test in general. We'll skip 1080p given the lack of improvement. Cyberpunk at 4K with RT Medium is next. In this test, the RTX Pro 6000 ran at 65 FPS average, leading the 5090 by 11%. That's roughly in line with what we saw on Cyberpunk rasterized. This is without any upscaling, which may be helping the Pro card's relative gain. And finally for this chart, unlike what we saw on the 5060 and 5070 class cards with significant VRAM limitations harming low performance, the Pro doesn't have any VRAM issues. This, clearly, is the solution. The solution is to spend $10,000 on video cards. And also, as before, note that some cards with low VRAM, like the 5070 and the 4070 Ti, have averages that look better than reality, even though the averages are also not great. 4K with RT Ultra is next. We almost never publish this test since it's so intensive that it becomes somewhat useless, but it's interesting here. The RTX Pro 6000 ran at 56.6 FPS average, leading the 5090 by 6.4%. That's a significant drop from what we saw at RT Medium, indicating that the increase in intensity for the RT workload is minimizing the benefit of the other aspects of the Pro 6000's improvements. It's getting overrun by the RT workload intensity. The lead over the 4090 is about 44% here for the 6000, with the 5090 leading the 4090 by 35% just for perspective. Note that the lower portion of the chart is once again unreliable for average frame rate since the cards are all unplayable and stuttering. This can sometimes be due to exceeding VRAM limitations, such as on the 5070, but also it could just be because the cards aren't powerful enough. This is a very heavy workload. The average looks far better than the reality in these though, even though the average is also unplayable. So just the numbers don't mean anything once they get that low. At 1080p with RT Medium, the Pro 6000 ran at 182 FPS average with lows paced proportionally. That has it ahead of the 5090 by about 12 FPS, or about 7%. Dragon's Dogma 2 with ray tracing without upscaling is next. Tested at 4K native, the RTX Pro 6000 at 121 FPS average leads the 5090 FE by about 7% in average frame rate. This is starting to match a pattern, so we'll let this be our last game test. Let's move on to something else. Now we'll get into some of our first ever LLM and machine learning benchmarks. Two things here. First of all, I am incredibly skeptical of so-called AI in general, or LLMs, and it doesn't matter for this review, I'm just putting it out there because we're going to test this stuff. I'm not thrilled about what I see for the future of humanity right now, and it's not because I think it's going to terminate us, it's for a whole lot of other complicated societal reasons that we'll talk about in a different video that I'm probably going to call Nobody Asked, because nobody did. But I'm going to tell you anyway, and that's for that video. I just want to put that out there though, because we are doing these tests, and we'll benchmark the stuff even if I don't necessarily feel thrilled about some of what I'm seeing, because there's use cases, so we'll test it, and that's what the card's meant for. But the second thing that's more important is that we know enough to get some charts together, to run some benchmarks where we feel like the controls are good, as in the parameters, the controls of the test environment, and we have repeatable, reliable results. However, we do not yet know enough to have a full picture of capabilities outside of the test suite that we're using currently. We've tested with LM Studio, we used 3D Mark testing, we used MLPerf and whatever, and we kind of settled on one set of stuff for right now just to experiment. And this is our full disclosure to you that we are experimenting with new testing, which means that the charts get the experimental chart label on top of them. And that's just so everyone's aware that these are not up to our full confidence standards of our normal benchmarks that we do all the time because we're learning. And likewise, they are wide open to your requests for future tests that may be in a similar vein. So if you're aware of a certain type of benchmark you'd really like to see tested for these scenarios in the future, even for the gaming consumer cards, then feel free to sound off below. We're going to pay more attention than we might normally because we're in the experimental stage for these types of charts. So we use the Studio drivers compatible with the card for this testing. Let's get into the benchmarks. For our LM Studio testing, we recorded the response speeds from 8 different models that incrementally increase in size. We'll get to larger models in a second here. We'll start with some of the smaller ones. Our first chart illustrates the average tokens per second results from the 3 smaller models, ranging from 8.5 gigabytes to around 19 gigabytes in size. We think these first 3 are more representative of like-for-like tests compared to some other models we'll be going over today, because any of the GPUs on our chart can load these without being limited by VRAM capacity. So the whole point of these specifically is to fit it all into memory to see how they perform in that situation. In DeepSeek Llama 8B Distill, the RTX Pro 6000 is functionally tied for first place with the RTX 5090 FE, both with response speeds of roughly 81 tokens per second, improving on the 4090's 62 tokens per second average by about 30%. In 8-bit 5.4, the Pro 6000 puts some distance between its own tokens per second average of 62 and the 5090's 51 tokens per second average, showing a 22% improvement. Compared to the 4090, the RTX Pro improves by about 43%. I'm going to go with Qwen, you can let me know in the comments. I've never had to say it out loud. 2.5, the Pro 6000's 44 tokens per second average sees improvements of 25% over the 5090 and 37% over the 4090. Moving to our next chart, we'll really start to see the performance gaps widen as VRAM limitations take effect. The RTX 6000 tops the chart in all 5 models. In intern LM, the RTX Pro 6000's 50 tokens per second average improves upon the 5090's 40 by 25%, and upon the standard 24GB 4090 by 319%. In Mistral Small 26GB, the 4090 and 5090 see much sharper performance decreases than the Pro 6000. The workstation GPU achieves 42.4 tokens per second average, or 147% improved on the 5090's 17 or so, and 560% greater than the 4090's average of 6.4. Once we reach Gemma 3 27B, the workstation card really starts to separate itself from the lowly $2,000 gaming cards. In this model, the RTX Pro 6000 achieves 29 tokens per second average, with the 5090 only reaching 5, and the 4090 only seeing 4 tokens per second, give or take some change there. The comparisons remain largely the same in QWQ32B. In the final Llama 3.370B Q4_K_S model we tested, the RTX Pro 6000 achieved its greatest lead yet. The workstation card sees improvements of 928% over the 5090 and 1141% over the standard 4090. A more simplistic way to interpret this data is, at a certain point, the cards run out of VRAM, while the workstation GPU doesn't even use half of its VRAM in the largest Llama model we tested. You could expand beyond this as well, of course, but that's the extent of our experimentation for today. So that's it for the RTX Pro 6000 test and review. I mean, it's a review in a way, but at the same time, we'd want to do a lot more tests in that sort of ML category to really have a fully fledged review. But you've got something out there. It's an experimentation for us that I'm excited about, even though I am a bit of a skeptic on some of the AI marketing bullshit that's out there. And again, that's for another time. But the biggest discovery for us was that there's no liquid metal here. That was probably known, but not something that we had looked into. And so I got to open it and get that surprise. That was interesting. I could see it for reliability reasons. I could also see it for liability reasons if they're worried about liquid metal leaking out into expensive servers or something. I kind of doubt this one's for cost. It may be for cost in other ways, like liability, but it just doesn't seem like they're going to try and save a buck on this kind of card. I spoke to Wendell, and he noted that there's some apparent buggy behavior with Blackwell right now. And so that's still getting, I guess, updated, and maybe there's performance optimizations that could be done. On the side that we're familiar with, the gaming side, seeing 5 to 14% improvement is mostly useful, not because you should ever in any way consider this card for gaming, because that would be an insane waste of money if that's all you would do with it, but more because it shows us that there's room left in the 9800X2D for scaling, which is pretty cool. Anyway, that's it for this one. If you're wondering what are our potential use cases for this next, I'm gonna see if we can overclock it. So I think it's probably pretty locked down, but I have some hard mod ideas. And if it looks promising and like we can mod it, I'm going to call Joe Stepanzi and we'll figure something out, and we'll do maybe a liquid nitrogen overclocking live stream with it. And then otherwise after that, it will probably go into an editing machine with less liquid nitrogen and more air. But anyway, that would be the plan for what we do next. I got to see. There's shunt on there. I can definitely shunt mod it and piggyback another shunt on there to expand the power limit. But we'll see. So anyway, it could be fun. That's it. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersaccess.net to help us out directly. And I will see you all next time.